Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our third panel on steering toward the Omega Point, Evolution, Consciousness, and Altruism. I'm Yanni Maniates of the Interspirituality Network, and as well of Forum 21. And this afternoon, Dr. David Sloan Wilson, author of Does Altruism Exist?, will give us a short framing introduction in a minute or so. And at first, I'll just be introducing our panel. And if you'd like to know more about our panel, their bios will be on our website. So we begin, over next by David, with Karenna Gore, who is the founder of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. Next to her is Carole Hart, who is a producer, writer, and filmmaker, and she was one of the original writers of Sesame Street, and in 2009 produced the film For the Next 7 Generations. That's about the 13 indigenous grandmothers. And next to her we have Myra Jackson, who is a founder of the Gaia-Field Project and the Subtle Activism Network, and active in the NGO community in the United Nations. Next to her, we have Rick Ulfik, who is the founder of both We.net and the 11 Days of Unity. Next to Rick, we have Robert Kadar, who is the founder of This View of Life and also of Evonomics. And next to him, we have Mahan Rishi Singh, Khalsa, scholar and principal teacher in the tradition of Kundalini Yoga and the Sikh tradition of Yogi Bhajan. And then next to Mahan Rishi, we have Mindahi Bastida Muñoz, who is prominent in the worldwide indigenous peoples and sacred sites work, and is a fellow at the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York. So it's an opportunity now for us to discuss the questions that each of our panelists have been given by Dr. Wilson. And the three questions frame around the importance of altruism in the process of evolution, around design principles for global change based on altruism, and around the potential emergence of heart intelligence globally. So Dr. Wilson now will open our discussion with about a 5-minute introduction.
Great, thank you very much. In my introduction to the previous two panels, I said that we're occupying a common ground based on the fact that everything is interconnected, and that we've arrived at this common ground from many, many different directions, some from a religious and spiritual or philosophical trajectory, others from a scientific or an environmental trajectory, but that once we arrive at this common ground, then certain ethical conclusions follow, namely that it becomes difficult to defend one part of the system against another part of the system when you truly begin thinking systemically. And we've had wonderful conversations on this for the first two panels. That's going to continue with the third panel. And at the very end of my book, which I regard as a report, a taste, basically, of what's been happening in my field of evolutionary science that's so relevant to this conversation, and in some ways is catching up with a vision that has been set by spiritual thinkers for a long, long time. And at the end of my book, I say that these recent ideas are as foundational as the ideas associated with the Enlightenment and the early days of evolutionary theory. That's how important it is. Sounds like a hubristic statement. Would be if it was made by an individual, but that's not the point. The statement is being made for the intellectual developments that are taking place and that we are discussing today. And I think that we are getting a taste of that at this meeting, and so nice that that will be made available to a broad audience through the fact of our video production. So I don't think I need to say much more. I think we want to dive in and to hear from our current panelist, and I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Okay, so we'll begin with Karenna Gore.
Thank you so much. I want to start by apologizing for being late, and preface this by saying I wasn't able to be in the first two panels, so I just interrupt me if I'm repeating or I'm outside the format, please. I basically want to let you know where I'm coming from first. I work at Union Theological Seminary and run the Center for Earth Ethics there. The Center for Earth Ethics came about because we were hoping to reframe climate change as a moral issue and to reach into the religious faith traditions for the best that they have to offer in order to do that reframing and in order to create activism and change. So obviously the themes in this work, does altruism exist, and of this conversation are very central to that. The strength of religion for climate change, and in some ways all of those terms are both really problematic themselves, is not only that they are, it provides an organizational structure to reach out through communities. A lot of people belong to religious communities, and that is how they experience their sense of moral obligation. In some countries, also religious communities are also the providers of the majority of healthcare even, so it certainly is relevant in that regard. But beyond the organizational, practical reasons for engaging religion, there's also the knowledge that religion calls people to something larger than themselves, that it activates this desire to have meaning and purpose and belong to something larger. I want to note that that's not always good, and that we have seen that, obviously, in the case of, to use an extreme example, which might have been brought up before, suicide bombing, these things that people are brought to do, are inspired to do because of a very deep conviction of a religious nature. And so I think in thinking about how, what connecting to something larger means in the context of climate change, it's also been useful to step back and see climate change as really about how we relate to each other across time and space, and that this is something about much more than the mechanics. It's really about the meaning, and that we need to do work in terms of how we calculate costs and benefits in general, how we use these types of measurements. And I think some of that needs to be imported into the conversation about altruism as well, so that, for instance, just to give an example, there was a story that I saw the other day about birds no longer migrating, and it said the storks are not migrating because they're eating trash, and so they just stay there. And then at the end of the story, it said, but this isn't all bad news for the storks, because it turns out they're having more babies. And I just thought, wow, that's within the framework that we have of what the ideal is. It's about productivity. It's about more young. It's about something that is not the real meaning there, which is the beauty of the cycles and the whole, and something that is about those interconnections themselves. So I just want to introduce that as an important thing. And then finally, I just want to say about what is religion. Obviously, there are many people speaking to that on deeper levels than I could. But most instructive has been this conversation and learning and dialogue with indigenous traditions in the context of a seminary, in which we've had interfaith dialogue across Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, and Christian for the most part, and then to introduce in a very prominent way a dialogue with indigenous traditions, some of which are like, we don't necessarily view this as a religion, it's the way you walk on earth, has been really important to understanding climate change, to understanding the roots of it, to understanding the limits of what religion has been able to do thus far. So I really love that you frame this by saying catching up with some of the ancient spiritual thinkers, because that's been our experience at Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karenna. And Carole, your opportunity now.
Okay, I am totally unprepared for this because I was just asked about an hour ago to be on this panel. But I think just following through with what you said, I have spent over the last few years, from 2004 to 2010, I was working on creating this movie with 13 indigenous grandmothers from around the world. And I traveled around the world with them to their homes, and I got to get a real sense of what the indigenous cosmos means and what the indigenous way of life means. And I also was introduced to it because in the late 90s, I was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer that had metastasized to my brain. And Western medicine gave up on me and called me terminal. And at the moment that they started using that word, I started getting messages from the universe about Native American healings. And I ended up in a Native American church meeting where peyote was the medicine. It was a 13-hour ceremony in a big teepee. And when I emerged from that meeting, I felt like every cell in my body had realigned itself. And then the roadman who ran the ceremony came and he said, "You've been healed. It's going to take a while for you to catch up." So I came home and my oncologist refused to do more scans, even though the roadman had said I needed to be scanning. So I found another doctor who would do the scans, and we watched all the cancer go away. So I was, given an opportunity to really live the indigenous way, because the only way I think that kind of healing works is if you believe that it can, and if you can take it in. So when the grandmothers appeared as a possibility, I felt like being a filmmaker. I had a karmic debt to pay back to make this movie for them. And I think it's because of that they agreed to it, because they don't like to be filmed. So we started out, and for 5 years we traveled around the world. We spent 90 minutes in Dharamsala with the Dalai Lama, and it was quite wonderful. But what I learned is that, talking about the indigenous way of their story of creation, and how they see the world, is that, the most important thing for them is the web of life, and how each of us is connected to everybody else, and that you can't do something in one part of the web without having it affect another part. And that's a basic premise where they start. Somebody gave me a book called the Ecology of the World of Sacred Ceremony, the Ecology of Creation, and in it she translated the story of Genesis 1 back into the original Aramaic and then back into English. And it had nothing to do with what's in the Bible. Instead, there was no dominion over anything. Everything was sacred. Everything was equal. Animals and people and rocks. Everything was sacred. And that's how indigenous people still look at the world. And when they go to do healings, they work with medicines that are natural medicines that are part of the earth, and they figure out how to make them help us to heal and get well. I think that just from knowing that the movie is quite powerful. I don't mean to tout my own horn, but I mean, the grandmothers are really quite extraordinary shamans and medicine women and mediums and they bring all people together. And so I know when we screen privately. I mean, we offer the movie for screenings for people, and they can bring groups of people. And the most important thing is that what happens after the movies, because almost everyone says, how can I make this work for everybody? And so that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Carole. And now Myra Jackson.
Well, if we're on, I'm going to pick up right where you left off, Carole. We've journeyed together. I'm going to tell the story of another grandmother. The grandmother is a grandmother whale, an orca whale, who is still swimming the waters as far as I know. She's tagged. Scientists have been following her. And the reason they've been following her is because she has managed to extend her life, already doubled the years of her life. And she's been doing that to lead the orca. It's a matrifocal culture, in essence, led by the female. And the orca population, as you may all know, was diminished greatly when we began taking them into captivity in places like SeaWorld. And the story is that this grandmother, now a grandmother, at the time, she was nearly captured, and she remembered the ways that they were tracked down as they were bringing the orca in. And those memories, it's believed, is what's keeping her alive until the orca population is substantial enough to ensure its continuity. When I look at stories like this, and there are many, I love to collect these stories, I collect them to upturn or look at the assumptions that underlie what we believe. I personally hold belief structures provisionally. I think that when we live long enough and are awake enough, that we end up overriding the belief systems that we adopt, if we're honest. And as a Vajrayana practitioner, that's the life of a Tantra. And so I share this to get to the point, to answer this question on altruism. I do see quantum equilibrium in nature. We are a part of nature. And I see altruism as one of those mechanisms that allows us to harmonize our world. And when we are making choices or have intentions that equate to what we know as selection, we get to use altruism. It's like the gazelle. The gazelle, the female gazelle, does not have horns unless there is a reason in the environment for her to grow those horns. If the environment becomes hostile, there's not enough water and food, the gazelle will grow horns. When there's no longer a need, those horns recede. I sense in everything that I'm experiencing that this is why we need to be looking at our relationship to the planetary body in which we have our being. That needs to become a metric. The wellness of the planet is the wellness of people. When I look at my teachers, they go to the Himalayas. They go to where the air is rarefied, where the environment is pristine. And where they do this, I believe their practice yields the possibility for them to turn on genes that are allowed to express because of the possibility that the equilibrium in those environments allow for, and they attain rainbow body and other such phenomenon. I believe this is within our capacity. I sense that this is what the codons within us that are dormant allow for. And I feel that altruism, when we see more and more of this, that our dormant capacities will be ignited. They can only be ignited when we're in an environment where we're choosing to be in harmonious relationship with one another. So this, in essence, to me, is a form of Ubuntu in action, that we really recognize that our humanity is bound up one in the other. And for me to care for your value and your sense of self and esteem is incredibly important to the quality of my own life. So here again, we're talking about the web of life in another way. But I see this really as that beginning conversation about the selfish gene versus the autism. Autism, how about that? I think that wasn't a slip. I think that spectrum of altruism and the selfish gene is being seen now in that spectrum because of our toxic environment. And within a toxic environment, it is as if we're all in a drunken society and yield those results. So those are my initial comments.
Thank you, Myra. Now we have Rick Ulfik.
Yes, my name is Rick Ulfik. I'm the founder of We the World and the We campaign at we.net. And I'll be talking about that a bit. So first of all, thank you so much to David Sloan Wilson and Kurt Johnson and everyone who made this extraordinary event possible. It's really an honor and a privilege to be part of it. So I believe that the groundbreaking work that you've been doing, David, has tremendous significance for the work that I'm doing with We the World and the We campaign that we're doing. And I want to talk a little bit about We the World and this kind of work that has to do with we, which I think is significant for what we're talking about. The mission of We the World is to maximize social change globally until we have a world that works for all. And every year through collaborative programs like the 11 Days of Global Unity, 11 Ways to Change the World, we connect and promote literally thousands of socially conscious organizations, individuals, and businesses to amplify their efforts and generate public awareness and action for a peaceful, sustainable planet. And so I was really excited to hear about this perspective on altruism that relates to the evolutionary process, because I think it confirms a theory that I've been talking about for many years. And in fact, this theory influenced the start of my organization, We the World, in 1998. So here's the theory, and you tell me how it connects. The idea is that 2 or 3 million years ago, when proto-humans were living on the plains of Africa, as they began to form communities, they realized that the survival of their entire group depended on the well-being and the survival of each and every member of their community. And so that was their core issue and their bottom line. In today's culture, we seem to have forgotten that, many of us, but I think that it still resides in us. And part of the idea of We the World and the We campaign is to reawaken that kind of core instinct in people so that we can come together and actually allow us to have a livable future. So we are actually in the process of promoting this idea of we consciousness and the common good. It's all about we, right? In the second of 3 video messages or video recordings that Desmond Tutu made for We the World, he invites people by saying that that he invites people to join a movement without which all the other movements for social change cannot be successful. And this movement is about making the shift from I to we. So we is 3 things. It's a it's a consciousness, a collaboration, and a campaign. And so what we consider to be part of our we is really a determinant, we believe, in the fate of humanity and the world. So is your we your loved ones, your family? Does it include your pets, your plants? Is it your ethnic group, your religion? Does it go beyond the? Is it the entire human family, or does it go beyond to the web of life? And even ecosystems like rocks and rivers and that are not intrinsically necessarily alive, or does it include Gaia? Anyway, so this is what we're focusing on, and I guess I'll leave you with what our advisory board member Jonathan Granoff said at the launch of the We campaign a few years ago. He said, "I hope that we expand so much that there is no longer any them." Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And now, Robert?
Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Kadar. I'm the founder of Evonomics. Just my backstory, I've worked a long time with David. David was my professor as an undergraduate and graduate. We got started with the Evolution Institute, which is his nonprofit organization that applies evolutionary science to everyday life, to the challenges of everyday life. One of the things that fascinated me about David's work was the confluence of evolutionary theory as it applies to human behavior, and what that really means. So actually understanding how humans evolved, what does that mean for society? How can we solve problems of our modern day society when we look at what it means to be human and how societies function well and societies don't function well. So I worked with David. One of the things that I noticed about the scientific community was that they were all converging along these similar ideas about a new paradigm for human behavior, for altruism, for cooperation. But what I also realized is that they were really bad at communicating that narrative, that new narrative. And there needed to be a kind of a translator of a lot of these great ideas. Academics, I often say, are not the best communicators, which for the most part I think is true. There's some, except for David, of course. So I've always come from a kind of a marketing, political, and somewhat of an ideological family where we always talked about how to get these new ideas out there to a larger audience. And so one of the things that I started was evonomics, because evonomics is basically what we call the new next evolution of economic thinking. The simple idea is that economics and the narrative of economics has been of this individualistic self-interest way of thinking about the world, and that paradigm was pretty good for the Enlightenment period. I think it helped out a lot society. But then as it transitioned, now we're transitioning into a more interconnected world where what we do here, what we do today actually affects us a lot more in the future. It affects other systems outside of our own economic system. We need a new enlightenment for this kind of way of thinking. We need people to actually converge with those ideas. And so there's a lot of great ideas here. But I think we also have to find a kind of common voice. I think that's one of the biggest challenges I've noticed here, is that we all have these kind of similar ideas, visions. We speak our own language in many ways, but how do we get beyond that and actually express a unified message to a larger audience? So that's evonomics. It's been incredibly successful. We've been online for 6 months. Have super advisors, including David and a lot of influential people who are actually acting as brand ambassadors for evonomics and this new approach of thinking about economics and policy and politics. One of the things that I want to get across to everyone, and I talked to Kurt about this, is that great ideas don't necessarily just diffuse by themselves or trickle down to the general audience. There's a belief that just great ideas will just get out there and that's it, and just leave them alone. Well, I think just like trickle down economics is bullshit, trickle down idea spreading is also BS. So one of the things that we want to do is really put this new narrative forward, a new paradigm that David has been really a part of and other people have been a part of, and we want to make it as pluralistic and also open to other perspectives. So check out evonomics, and I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you, Robert. And now Mahan Rishi.
Thank you, Yanni. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kurt and David and all the staff here. And my goodness, it's fantastic. Well, I just request everyone just to breathe and come into the present moment and into our hearts. I think we're talking about science and religion and spirituality. I think most people wouldn't necessarily put themselves into any particular category of anything. And if we can just enter this whole human experience and conversation from our heart, it will create a whole beautiful, spacious, edgeless, seamless flow between each other. And as we continue to awaken, I think, as Myra was talking about, we are bringing forth, we're accessing this dormant energy. And rishis and yogis have been actually talking about this for thousands of years. I think it would be wonderful for scientists to go into the cave and go into the mountains and to go into oneself, really go into the heart of one's being, because I think that's where the journey of discovery really is. And also, you know, with what Carole was talking about in her sacred ceremony of alignment of her cells, the importance of each of us to find internal alignment with soul consciousness. And whether we believe in religion, spirituality, God, or whatever, there is an expansion of consciousness that is transcendent and all-pervading. And as we access that and are in touch with that and allow ourselves to flow into that, we realize the inherent interdependence of all beings, and that consciousness is present in all beings. In that reality and that understanding, our heart naturally opens to one another. That presence of altruism and compassion and love and kindness naturally is expressed. I think as we continue, each of us, to do the inner work on ourselves and to purify, to awaken, to connect with that essence of spirit and being, which is universal, we're going to have this natural expression of this conversation. In terms of evolution, I don't think evolution really is about adaptation. When I think of adaptation, I'm thinking more in terms of survival and change. Evolution is really more about a quantum shift in consciousness. The great teachers have talked about this for centuries. As that quantum shift happens, there is a natural opening. Just like when there is a true sense of unconditional love, there is a natural sense of opening and being inclusive and connected and understanding and respect. And as that flow continues to manifest, we're going to see a beautiful planet. I'm extremely optimistic about what's happening. There are literally thousands, if not millions, of people who are thinking the same way and who are activating the energy. Prophets, gurus, teachers have talked about this time for thousands of years. I think we're catching the wave, and there will be, Nostradamus predicted 1,000 years of peace. And I am very committed and I feel very optimistic about this vision. And I think it may be of great value for us to look forward and let's see if we can look back and from this omega consciousness and look into the world from the world as already healed. If we look at the world just like relationship, rather than looking at relationship as from the place of conflict and struggle, if we look at our world as if it's already healed, what would it look like? And from that vision, we are already implementing, we're already manifesting that consciousness and the power of that reality. So it's fantastic. It's really fantastic. I feel like we are on the edge of something profound that's already evolving, it's already awakening, it's already coming forth, and it's the birth of a great world. Thank you. Peace.
Thank you, Mahan, Rishi, and Mindahi now.
I just want to mention that I am in the Center for Earth Ethics at the Union Theological Seminary in the program of original caretakers, and I come from Mexico, central Mexico, Toluca Valley. I think the notion or the idea of altruism is a very good idea, and but it's, for me, it's kind of like a willingness. But when we talk, or when we see this in the communities world, there is a concept which is called the comunalidad, which is communality. And the word that you have shared here in this panel, as we, in many indigenous languages, many original people's languages, the word you or me doesn't exist. It exists the we. And it's not just related to human beings, but all relations. It means animals, minerals, rocks, even the stars. Because in our stories we know that we came from the stars, from the Pleiades, and that we came to this Mother Earth as a gift to take care about this beautiful being. But as we have developed many thoughts and many notions and science, and we have kind of segmentarized even the most minimum notion of life, which is also something worth to understand life, but it's not enough. So we don't need to understand everything. And in the communality, the notion of altruism goes beyond, because it's an obligation. It's a relationship between all beings, an acknowledgement And it's not an option, but you are obliged to pay back. It's reciprocity. So in the Western mind, I think altruism is a transition concept, which is very worth. But we need to go back to the original instructions. Because we talk about, even Elinor Ostrom, you know, when you talk about the poor resource, the common resource, you are talking about economics. And you commoditize, or you see everything like things. And to tell you the truth is that we have gone beyond our desires. So we need to really to understand that, for example, water, the fire, the air, the earth, they are not resources. They are elements, and they are sacred. So we need to go back to the original thoughts, and of course we need to think in the future, but taking into account the past. So this notion of consciousness also, we need to be very aware that we are part of this holy creation, and the energies that tell us that we are here together is because, of course, we are we are ending in our knowledge. We are ending a very big era, which is, it counts for the 5,200 years. Is the end of this big calendar, the Mayan calendar and the Aztec, the Otomi calendar, and it's telling us that it's coming the new dawn, and we are in this process. So we have hope, but more than information, because we have a lot of information. Just imagine in the internet, the books, but we need that information. But more than information, we need that this information is taken care about for the new generation to come. But we need more than information, wisdom. We need wisdom, because if we don't apply the information correctly, is why we are like we are in this crisis. But we are in these transitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists, for a very enlightening discussion and enriching. We're going to pass it over to David now, and to all of you, to just bring up whatever questions you have for each other. And David, if you have questions for the panel.
If I could, this is such a feast of ideas here, and I think it's so important. The main import of this event, I think, will be to initiate this conversation not only among ourselves, but also to a much larger public. And the more we can all begin thinking about these new ideas, the better it will be. So much to say. I'm going to keep it very brief to turn it back to you, but I wanted to begin with Myra's wonderful story about the orcas. And absolutely true, there are other animals, other species with cultural traditions, and that are conveyed by elders. And your orca whale is an example. There's examples with elephants and other. These are typically social mammals. They're long-lived. And the reason that we have grandmothers and old grandmother orcas and grandmother humans is because they are the bearers of knowledge and are carrying that forth. And the reason that this can happen is because culture is a form of cooperation. And the reason that we're exceptionally good at culture as humans is because we're exceptionally cooperative in all respects. Typically in small groups, and of course we're trying to expand the moral circle. The idea of cultural evolution, often wisdom is it works without anyone knowing why it works. And so traditions are carried forward, and they're winnowed, and they result in a wisdom that we don't understand. It works without knowing how it works. But the importance of tradition is one part, and yet at the same time it has to evolve. it has to change to meet new circumstances. And I find it very interesting that someone like the Dalai Lama, who you, Carole, mentioned, can be so flexible that he can, in some ways, go beyond his own tradition while recognizing the wisdom of that tradition and write a book called Beyond Religion. To basically do some of that winnowing process. Somehow religions, at least certain kinds of religions, can be very good at that. And I just finally, again, not to speak too long, but if you were to nominate a profession in which that is devoid of spirituality, it would probably be the economics profession. And yet, this conversation that we're having here is also taking place in the profession of economics, and that's what Robert's work represents, and some of the work that we're doing with the Evolution Institute represents. It's appearing in academic economic journals, and now it's becoming known to a wide audience through Robert's work. But I think it's so interesting that the economics profession could be so different, in some ways so detached from the spiritual community, and yet the same conversation is taking place out of vengeance. And do we ever need to connect those two things? And I think that part of what Karenna's work represents is to take something which is often studied in a non-spiritual context, such as climate change and environmentalism and economics and so on, but actually to appreciate the importance of bringing in the religious and spiritual component. And I would love these two conversations, which are currently taking place apart from each other, to bridge them. And I think that bridging does take place. David Corton, I think, represents somebody who bridges those. The whole social responsibility business movement is part of that. So these bridges are being made, but the more they could be made, the better. So apologies for speaking for so long. Let me turn it back to anyone to add to the conversation.
Well, yeah. I think this is a wonderful model for opening up the whole flow and understanding. I've sat on a number of different interfaith panels, and it just doesn't have the same feel. And I think it would be wonderful to see this out in the public, because the spectrum of conversation is so open and vast and so inclusive to everyone. Yeah, good work, you guys and gals. Yeah.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Yeah. Rick and I are currently working on a project called Urgent Message from Your Children. And we're pulling together children from the world to talk about, to give to the adults in their lives who are preventing climate change from happening, who aren't preventing climate change from happening, to let them know what the children are feeling about it, because we don't feel like we've been able to communicate with them successfully. And so we just recorded a bunch of children. And the thing to me that was the most impressive was how many of the children not only talked about how they're frightened for themselves, but how they're very concerned with the next generations. And they're thinking about that. And that's the way many of these children are thinking, of the consequences, not just for themselves, but for the next generations, which to me is astonishing. I mean, it really means that there's something going on outside of us with our younger people that have already been catching up to this. So I just wanted to pass that along.
Yeah.
It's out there.
Robert.
Yeah, one of the things about this workshop that I kind of am not kind of wanted to push back on was this idea of like that cooperation and altruism is the main game, or the only game right now in the system that we have today. And I think what I wanted to push back on is to just say that, you know, assholes do have an evolutionary advantage. Selfishness is a huge part of evolution. It shapes societies. The default, I think, in history has been, for human societies, has been feudal oligarchies and so on. So I kind of want to push back against this idea that of this idea of a progressive evolution. What David's book, to me, what it says, there's a term that David uses. It's called, I think you call it the iron law of evolution or multi-level selection.
Iron law of multi-level selection.
Yeah, well, you could explain it, maybe, or do you want me to explain?
Continue.
It? So it's the simple way of saying it is that what's good for me is not necessarily good for my family. What's good for my family is not necessarily good for my tribe. What's good for my tribe is not necessarily good for my city, and all the way up the hierarchy you can go. That's, I think, one of the things that's been so destructive about the kind of the economic ideology out there, that it's been based solely on this idea that my own interest can scale up to society as a whole, and that the economy will work well if I just focus on myself. Another point that I wanted to make is that ideologies do compete often, right? So the reason why we have this self-interested ideology, I think that all of us are pushing back on, is because there has been a lot of force and movement in media and with organizational groups, free market think tanks, Heritage Institute, Cato. They've all been a part of pushing this kind of economic ideology out there. And there needs to be some kind of message that we can bring together as a kind of counter message or a competing message that's just as compelling as their message. So.
That's, I tried to make the same point myself when I said that stages should be regarded as competing forms, basically. But Mahini?
Yes, I wanted to raise this idea about the beautiful word about interconnectedness in your book. I think we share this basically with native peoples, because in the very deep spiritual practices among indigenous peoples, what I have seen, especially in South America and elsewhere, we have seen that phenomenon that we really see in the third level, this interconnectedness, not just in the material or in the intangible, but even in the intangible world, but in the spiritual world.
Right.
So this is beautiful, and I think it's so nice that you share with many public audiences that they also need to understand this. But from the native perspective, is that we really need to share also our wisdom. Because when you see most of the native communities and original peoples around the world, it's where you see that we still exist. Also, the biodiversity, the natural biodiversity still exists, more pristine. So this is connected to the philosophy.
Right.
But not just the thought, but the doing. So, which means it's a biocultural way of living. So we don't see these worlds separated but united. So in this case, we need to work together and pull together.
Absolutely, and I wanted to comment on your previous statement and also bring in something that Rick said about cooperation is key, and it is key. I say in the book, cooperation is the signature adaptation of our species, typically at a small scale. So scaling up is always an issue. But you gave 3 C's: consciousness, collaboration, and campaign. I would like to add another C, which is control system. And it brings us back to what Mindahi said, that it's an obligation to do this. And the reason that we're such a cooperative species is not because we became compassionate only. Yes, we did. That's the empathetic side. But it's also that we were able to hold each other under control, so that the person that did fall out of line, that became self-aggrandizing, and so on and so forth. There were ways to check those people at a small scale. So it's thanks to social control, and that's what the Ostrom principles represent. You're right that they're framed in economic terms. That could, we might want to alter that. But really what makes our group work is that it makes it safe to be an altruist. It makes it safe to be an altruist. And if you take away those controls, then if you try to be an altruist, then you will probably be exploited. So that's what's so key. And then scaling it up is, in order to avoid the iron law of multi-level selection, is we have to extend that social control system. That other side of the morality coin has to be scaled up. And if you don't, then when you persuade people to be altruists, and this is a common problem. There's a chapter in my book called Pathological Altruism. Altruism can have pathological, and you really have to worry about, you convince somebody, whether through the heart or through the mind, to be other-oriented, and then put them into a world that doesn't have the social controls. We call that declawing the cat. You don't take an alley cat and take away its claws and put it back in the alley. You got to change the alley. So that's what it means, I think, to be a smart altruist. And with social design is that we have to build in that control aspect in order to get altruism to win the Darwinian contest, which is a point that Rick made.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that. I don't think that's actually true. I think it's really giving to fear. And I think that to be vulnerable, to be fully heart-centered and open is the path that's going to awaken more. I see it over and over and over, where people can really, truly be vulnerable and open and don't have to navigate this. I think this is the problem. I think people feel that they're not supported if they don't live, if they're living heart-centered. But when people live fully heart-centered, there's an incredible amount of energy that's released. And just like the earth itself is a heart-centered presence of being. And as people really embrace the full heart-centeredness of being, there's an incredible power in that. And I think that people, I think we're married to fear in some ways, and that's why people armor themselves. I think the power of true compassion, of openness, of being vulnerable is the path. Like Mark Nepo, the poet, said, "The flower doesn't dream of the bee. It blossoms and the bee comes." Okay, so it's the same with all of us. If we can just let our heart and our gifts truly open and not have to go through some whole trip about, how am I going to navigate through the world with a heart open, it's going to be a different world. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great comments, by the way. I don't, deserving applause. But please, let's continue.
Yes, so, yes, I also want to pick up on that. The word control, I think, has negative connotations to it because people don't really want to be controlled. It's like a demand rather than a request, that kind of thing, nonviolent communication, that kind of thing. And so what we talk about in the We campaign is more like creating an environment that fosters a cultural shift. So in the same way that you can try to have a contract between two people and write down exactly what both parties have to agree to, or you can have an environment where both parties don't even have to write something down because the norm of the environment is to keep your agreement with the other person and support them and all of that. So that kind of cultural shift, and what we talk about is a cultural shift towards we consciousness, is this idea. So our strategy is really to create, to expand that definition of what we means, because our we, whatever level that is, there's no member of our we that is expendable, right? And so the well-being of all the members of the we, and if you expand that as a cultural kind of idea to include the entire web of life and ecosystems and the world and the sun, et cetera, then we'll have the kind of culture that can support us moving into kind of a wisdom culture instead of dystopia.
Please, yes.
I'll make a really quick comment. I'll try to. There's a reason that when we look at, an EEG, that we can see the heartbeat of the other on our own monitor. I think that there is a reason that we are wired that way. And the big meta change that I see is really metanoia, a big change of mind about our relationship to one another that tips this idea. We are stronger with nature. I have done the studies myself. I'm an electrical engineer. We are more resilient and stronger when we're connected to the earth. And this is where this comment of altruism really makes a difference, because that field, that state of consciousness that we hold, that it has an impact and does condition space. Dr. Tiller has done these studies at a quantum level that shows how particles rearrange in space where there is a coherent pattern available. So we have to remember we're walking with that capacity to have an impact on the environment. We can condition the spaces we're in by the state of our own consciousness, and we can measure that. That's what the Hart work has brought to us, and I wanted to add that earlier. Thank you.
So we got 1 minute to, and I have 5 minutes after the 1 minute, so I'm going to not take this 1 minute. Who else wants to talk for the remaining 1 minute? Karenna, would you like to?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? I just wanted to add that picking up on something that I meant to communicate in my opening remarks, about measurements and how sometimes when we talk about success, we're still measuring that by productivity and reflecting this society in which the economic measurements that have been primarily GDP and that sort of thing, still bringing that into a conversation about altruism, so that if, as you suggested, the not so nice people do have an advantage and become successful, does that mean they pass on their genes more and they have more cars and bigger houses, and but peace of mind and contribution to the whole, grace is a concept from religion that I think is a very powerful concept, and you can see it in the Beatitudes and the example from the tradition I was raised in, certainly the teachings of Jesus and the life example. This is not altruism that is beneficial in a way that we can measure by those terms. There's an element of grace that is a deeper meaning of life, and so I just appreciate so many comments here that have opened that up about what that means. Thank you.
Yeah, so great. So now 5 minutes to wrap up, to close, and so what a great day this is. This has been. I want to make a quick point that if you look at orthodox economic theory, fondly known as Homo economicus, as if a description of a biological species, it departs from factual reality as flagrantly as any religion. And one of the things that is taking place here is basically the first authentic origin story. What have we had up until now? We've had Adam and Eve. We've had Rousseau's Noble Savage. We've had the Hobbesian war of all against all. We've had Homo economicus. And for the first time, we have actually the beginning of a scientific, authentic story as to how our species came into being and what it is really like. So that is momentous in its own way. But this conversation has been very interesting, and in some ways at loggerheads in a bit, disagreement basically, which is surfacing in addition to agreement, and that's why it needs to continue. I can agree with you in actually everything that you've said, and that the flower opens, doesn't think of the bee, and then is visited by the bee. I think that's true in the case of humans as well. That the person who is simply other-oriented, unconditionally, and that what motivates them as a person is visited by another like-minded person often enough so that that kind of person and that kind of system can thrive. But it does require being visited by the bee. And if it's not, then we have the problem that Robert has articulated. There's not a social system on earth, small or large, and that definitely goes for religions, bristling with social control mechanisms. And we might not want to use the word control. We might want to use the word covenant. And covenant means basically that we agree on controlling each other. This is not being forced upon us, one by the other. That's what's, I think, problematic about the control word. But the covenant word avoids that, because that's what we decide to do. And when we decide to do something, we hold each other to that. That means if we don't do it, there's consequences. And there's no group on earth where anything can go. So there's agreed upon behaviors, and if we don't do it, then there are consequences. And they don't need to be harsh consequences. In fact, part of the Ostrom design principles is they begin not harsh. They begin as the friendly reminder, the brotherly admonition in religious terms. But if it keeps up, then exclusion and other things is the only way to save the group. So I think that the idea that we have this two sides of the morality coin, that's a very important point that survives, despite the fact that given that, then the kind of person that you describe and the kind of culture and the kind of practices that results in that kind of person and comes from the heart in addition from the head is definitely what we hope will and can happen. So I think that this has been such a wonderful day, and I have 1 minute left. I'm not even going to use it because we need not 1 minute, but we need years and decades in order to continue this conversation. And what we've done today is to set the stage so that this conversation can be shared by a potentially unlimited number of people, and we can then it can go forward. So thanks to everyone in the audience and in this panel for taking their part.